In this lecture, we're going to be talking about the anatomy of a formula. And this is important because there are a number of different parts to each formula, which you can add or remove from a formula to change the calculation that it will do. So in this lecture, we're going to talk about 6 main pieces that you will find in formulas, plus a couple of other common elements that you'll find on a regular basis. So let's just take a look at a completed formula so we can see what it looks like. If we click on that cell, you'll see this basic sum formula, and the first part of our formula is the equal sign. You always start any formula with an equal sign. The equals essentially just tells Excel that you are about to enter a formula. The second part of this formula is the function, and in this case we're using the sum function, which we've already learned about. And as you recall, a function is just a little piece of code that adds steroids to your formula and allows you to do much more powerful calculations. Next up in this formula, we have the parentheses. Parentheses do 2 things. In this formula, they are defining the cell reference. So these parentheses are defining cells A1 through A2 in this formula. Another thing that parentheses can do is define your order of operations. So for example, if I have a sum formula here, and I want to say 2 plus 2 times 5, if you recall from math class, putting those parentheses in there makes a difference in your equation by defining your order of operations. So if we have it written like this, 2 plus 2 in parentheses times 5, you have to do what's in the parentheses first. So you'll do 2 plus 2 and get 4, and then you'll take 4 times 5 and you'll get 20. So if we go back into this equation and we move this parentheses over to here, it now changes the order of operations because you have to do the multiplication before you do the addition, unless parentheses define it differently. So you have to do, in this equation, you do 2 times 5 and get 10, then you add the 2 and you get 12. And you'll see if I hit enter, that's what we have. So in this above equation, we have 2 plus 2 is 4, then times 5 is 20. And in this equation, because we've moved the parentheses over to the outside, we have 2 times 5 is 10, plus 2 is 12. So that's what parentheses do. They modify your order of operations. Back to this equation, the more common use of parentheses is that they define cell references. So in this case, it's defining our cell reference to cells A1 and A2. If you didn't have these parentheses here, you would get an error. And in fact, I can show you what that looks like. See, it gives you a name error because it doesn't understand what you're referring to without the parentheses. So I'll undo that to fix it. So that's what the parentheses do. And speaking of cell references, that brings me to the next one, number 4, which we've basically already talked about. But this inside your parentheses here is your cell reference. And your cell reference essentially supplies the data for your calculations. Another name for a cell reference is a function argument. And I'll show you what I mean by that. If we go back here and we click on the sum function from here, it's going to bring up our function arguments. Your function argument is the data that you're referring to that you want Excel to use in your formula. And you always define your function arguments with parentheses. And in fact, you can see Excel is doing it automatically for me here. So that's your function argument. The 5th part of our equation here, and let me go back to our original formula. The 5th part of our equation is an operator. And you might remember operators from math as well. Operators are plus, minus, divide, and multiply. Those are the most common operators. There are also greater than, less than. You can use the greater than and less than symbols together, which means does not equal, or you can use the equal sign. So those are operators, which you probably recall from math as well. And then the next one is, number 6, is constants. And constants is a number or text in your formula that does not change. So that's our number 2 in this equation, as opposed to a cell reference where I could go into this cell and I could change the number and it would change the answer. But a constant will always stay the same. So that number 2 is a number 2 and it will always be that way in the formula. So those are the 6 parts of our formula. There are a few other elements that you will use from time to time. The most common ones are probably quotation marks, which defines text within your formula, commas, which would be used in your cell references, and we've talked about this, but the difference is when you do A1 colon A2, it means A1 through A2, so you're picking out an entire range of cells. When you use a comma, you are referring to A1 and A2, so you're really just defining two cells. And you can create lists of cells like this. You could say A1, A2, and D1. So that's what you use the comma for. And then, of course, the colon you use for the range. So if we wanted to do A1 through E1, we can select it like that. Excel will automatically enter in the colon to give us the full range of these numbers. So that's the anatomy of a formula. We learned about the equal sign, the function, the parentheses to define your range and your order of operations, the cell reference or the cell argument, the use of operators, the addition of a constant, which is a number or text in your formula that doesn't change, and then quotations, commas, and colons, which are some other common elements that are used. So that should help you to not only understand formulas better, but to be able to troubleshoot them, modify them, and create formulas to do the calculations that you want to do in your spreadsheets.